Friday the 13th, Part 2, the novelization by Simon Hawke. Chapter 7. The music in the main house prevented them from hearing Terry's frenzied screams. They had the stereo turned up, and Mark and Jeff sat at the table, locked in an arm wrestling combat as the girls watched and cheered them on. "Come on!" said Vicki, sitting close to Mark, urging him on. "Come on, Mark!" Both boys were grimacing as their arms wavered first one way and then the other. But it was clear that Mark was stronger. As Jeff started to weaken, he grunted in exasperation and used his other arm to pull Mark's arm down. Both boys laughed. "Cheater," said Vicki, grinning at him. 2 out of 3, said Jeff, flexing his fingers. Sandra saddled up to him and bumped him with her hip. "Jeff, don't wear yourself out," she said in a low, husky voice. "You want to wrestle? Come up here with me." She pulled him to the couch. Jeff required no coaxing. He sat down and pulled her into his lap. Her arms went around his neck and their lips met in a long, passionate kiss. Vicki watched them for a moment, then leaned close to Mark and spoke into his ear. "You want to take me on?" she said softly. Mark wasn't sure how to respond to her. Just looking at her was enough to make his heart start hammering away inside his chest. But he didn't want to leave himself open to being hurt again. Some girls just flirted with him to be kind. He'd had more than his share of that sort of kindness. He had feelings too, and just because he was confined to a wheelchair didn't mean he couldn't feel normal male desire. "Okay, have a seat," he said. He smiled and put his arm up. "I only want your fingers," Vicki said, her eyes staring deeply into his. He raised his eyebrows. "What?" She produced 3 little electronic games and laid them on the table. "Take your pick," she said, smiling. "They're Ted's. It's okay with him." Mark picked up the little boxes one at a time, examining them. Football, hockey, baseball. He glanced at Vicki. What was happening here, he asked himself. Was it only his imagination, or was this incredibly gorgeous girl actually coming on to him? "What's your pleasure?" he said, trying to keep his voice level. "The one with the puck," she said slyly. Mark cleared his throat. You mean, hockey?" She stared at him innocently. "Is that what you call it?" Mark flushed slightly, not certain if she was flirting with him or teasing him. "Jesus, girl, don't do this to me," he thought. "Don't rattle my chain. It's not fair." "What do we play for?" he asked. Vicki moved a little closer to him and smiled seductively. "Position," she said, looking straight into his eyes as they played. On the couch, Sandra broke the long kiss with Jeff and slowly got up to her feet. She reached out for Jeff's hand and, smiling, led him up the stairs. Mark and Vicki watched them go and exchanged knowing glances. "Your turn," Vicki said, handing the computer game to Mark. Their hands touched briefly as she passed the game to him, and she felt the electricity in the brief contact. 3 goals or you're gonna lose," she said, looking directly into his eyes, saying things with her expression that she was not saying with words. "I've heard that one before," said Mark, taking the game and punching the small buttons. Was it possible that he wasn't just imagining this? He was really getting turned on. He'd been attracted to her from the first moment they met. Could it be that she felt the same way for him? As he played with the computer game, Vicki started to roll a joint. She glanced at him, intent on the small screen, and, for a moment, she hesitated, not sure how to bring the subject up. Then she took a deep breath and decided what the hell, just come right out with it. "Mark," she said, not merely looking at him, making it seem merely a casual question. "What happened that you have to be in a wheelchair?" "Motorcycle accident, paralyzed my legs." Vicki swallowed nervously. "Is it permanent?" "Doctors think so," Mark said. "I don't." He glanced at her. "I don't intend to be in this thing the rest of my life," he said firmly. Vicki pinched the ends of the joint. She touched her tongue to her upper lip. "Just your legs, huh?" she said in an offhand manner. She hesitated, then took the plunge. Everything else is okay? Mark understood her meaning. Oh, I do all right, he said, trying to keep his voice steady. One way or another. She smiled. Toke, she said, holding out the joint. He shook his head. I'm in training, remember? For what? She said, giving him a level stare. Upstairs, Jeff lay in bed, tooting his harmonica and watching as Sandra slowly unbuttoned her tight shorts and eased them down over her hips, smiling seductively and maintaining direct eye contact with him all the time. She ran her tongue lightly over her teeth and crawled on top of him, pushing up his shirt and kissing his stomach softly. She slipped his shirt off over his head and put her arms around him, pulling him close as they kissed, their tongues tasting each other. Then she pulled off her blouse and pressed up against him, lightly running tongue across his parted lips, feeling the moistness between her legs as her nipples grew hard against his bare, smooth chest. Downstairs, Mark put down the computer game, having failed to score enough goals to beat Vicki. He conceded defeat with a sigh. What does the winner get? Said Vicki, in a low and husky voice as she looked deep into his eyes. What does the winner want? Mark asked her. She stared at him, her eyes sending smoldering messages. Guess, she said softly, leaning forward and kissing him gently on the lips, once, twice, then slipping her tongue into his mouth. After a moment, she drew back. Want to stay together tonight? She whispered. I was just about to ask you, Mark said. Vicki smiled. My cabin or yours? Ted's in mine, said Mark, thinking that the last thing he needed was to have Ted coming back late and walking in on them. I don't think that would work out. Vicki put out the joint. We've got the whole camp, she said. We'll find our own cabin. She stood up. Just give me a few minutes to get a few things, okay? Sure, he said, swallowing hard, hardly able to believe that this was really happening to him. She bent down and gave him a quick kiss. I'll be right back, she promised in a whisper. She went outside and hurried down the path back to her cabin, humming to herself happily. She had been so afraid that things might not work out between them, that Mark, because of his injuries, might not be able to make love, or that he would take her coming on to him as a show of pity, or worse still, as some sort of perverse desire on her part to have an unusual sexual experience. Nothing could be further from the truth. In fact, she was more than a little nervous about spending the night with him. She had never made love with a handicapped person before. She had no idea what to do. She guessed she'd just have to be on top, but beyond that, she really wasn't certain how to go about it. Was there anything she might inadvertently do that could hurt him in any way? She was sure Mark would take charge and tell her what to do. She just didn't want to seem awkward with him. She wanted it to be right between them. She ran up the stairs to her cabin and went inside. After flicking on the light, she briefly checked herself in the mirror, then went over to the dresser and took out a fresh blouse. She slipped out of her halter top and into the blouse, then rummaged through the drawer in which she kept her panties until she found the one she was looking for, a pair of sheer black silk bikini panties. She held them up and smiled. She dropped her jeans and stepped out of them, then quickly changed her panties, putting on the black ones that felt so good against her skin. She walked over to the bathroom and took her perfume out of her travel bag. She sprayed a small amount of the perfume onto her wrists, the backs of her ears, the nape of her neck, the cleft between her breast, and finally, with a salacious grin, she stuck the bottle inside her panties and gave herself a squirt for good measure. Leaning over the dresser, closer to the mirror, she turned her head to either side, examining her face. She raked her fingers through her hair, checked the results, and made a face. She rummaged in the travel bag once more, then looked around on top of the dresser. In the drawers. No luck. She couldn't find her hairbrush in the bathroom either. She tried to think where she might have left it. Snapping her fingers, she ran out to her car, which was parked just outside. She opened the door and stuck her head inside, looking around on the front seats and in the glove compartment. She sighed, getting frustrated, and then she thought to look underneath the seat when her fingers closed around the handle of a plastic hairbrush. She withdrew it triumphantly. "There you are," she said, holding it up. A rumble of thunder caused her to look up at the sky. Dark clouds were scuttling across the moon. It was about to start pouring rain. It certainly wouldn't do to go to the trouble of fixing herself up, only to have the rain come down as she was on her way back. She'd walk in looking like a wet cat. She'd have to hurry. She hoped Mark wasn't getting too impatient. Mark sat alone downstairs in the main house, listening to the sounds of Jeff and Sandra making love upstairs and the storm that just started outside. The radio was off and the house was very still. He could hear Sandra giggling upstairs. He smiled. It seemed that everyone was pairing off. Jeff and Sandra, Scott and Terry, Paul and Jenny, and now Vicki and himself. Poor Ted. It looked as if he was going to get left out in the cold. But maybe he'd find someone in town. Mark certainly hoped so. He knew what it was like to feel lonely. He wondered what was keeping Vicki. She was probably nervous. He hoped she hadn't gotten cold feet and changed her mind. It wasn't easy trying to get a girl to like you when you were stuck in a wheelchair. Sometimes it wasn't easy getting people to respond to you at all. They were either too responsive, Mark thought, going out of their way to be helpful and often interfering in the process, or they simply treated you like some sort of helpless infant who could not fend for himself. And there were some people who were so disturbed by the idea of someone who was handicapped that they acted as if they didn't even see you. He didn't know what was worse, being pitied and condescended to, or being ignored. Vicki wasn't like that. At first, he thought she might be one of those girls with a really strong maternal instinct, someone who saw him as an object of pity and wanted to mother him. But he had clearly misjudged her. She had offered to push his chair just once, and when he had insisted on doing it himself, she had backed off immediately. In fact, he realized that he had unintentionally hurt her feelings. He had seen the expression on her face out of the corner of his eye, and he had winced inwardly at his own insensitivity. There had been no need for him to be so abrupt with her. He could have thanked her for her well-meaning intentions. He could have smiled, but she had realized instinctively that he was touchy about accepting help from other people, and she had not held it against him. Instead, she had gone out of her way to try to get to know him. When she looked at him, she didn't see a wheelchair. She saw a guy who just happened to be in one. He heard what sounded like a footstep on the porch stairs, and he swiveled his chair around. "Vicki?" he said anxiously. He hoped it wasn't the others coming back. He didn't want anything to spoil it. He wheeled himself over to the front door. It sounded as if someone was standing out there, not certain about coming in. "Vicki, is that you?" he said. He reached out and opened the door, shoved it hard, and rolled his chair out onto the front porch. He looked around. There didn't appear to be anybody there. It was dark, and the black clouds rolled across the full moon. The wind, rain, and storm was getting stronger. Thunder rumbled. Lightning flashed upon the bright steel blade as it swished through the air and thudded into Mark's face, slicing through flesh and crunching through bone in one unbelievably powerful stroke. Mark never knew what hit him. He never even had a chance to cry out. He was already dead as the wheelchair rolled backward from the impact of the savage blow, tilting and then crashing down the stairs. His body lay completely still in a tangled heap at the foot of the porch steps, and then it was slowly dragged away, leaving behind a smeared trail of blood, unnoticeable in the darkness, and washed away by the rain. The slow tread of the heavy work boots made the porch steps creak ominously as he climbed them. but the sound of the whistling wind and the rolling thunder grounded out his approach. He reached for the doorknob and turned it slowly. Lightning flashed as it opened soundlessly, casting his giant shadow on the door and letting a brief gust of wind come into the living room before the door swung shut behind him. He looked around. The dying embers of a fire were glowing in the hearth. A few empty beer bottles and a bowl of popcorn were on the table, along with the several computer games. A girl's embroidered denim jacket was laying on the couch. A chessboard was laid out on the coffee table, the pieces still left in the same position as they'd been at the conclusion of the last game. A crude Indian-style wooden spear tipped with iron was leaning against the wall over by the stairs, a grotesque rubber monster mask hanging from it. He crossed the room and reached out for the rubber mask, which he removed from the spear and dropped onto the floor. He picked up the spear and felt its heft. It felt strong. The point, hand-chiseled from a stone and shaped like a large arrowhead, was firmly lashed to the wooden shaft. It would not break loose. He closed his fingers around the long shaft of the spear, almost caressing it. The sound of muffled laughter, followed by a high-pitched squeal of delight, came from the second floor. He turned and, with a grim purpose, started slowly climbing up the stairs. Halfway up, one of the steps creaked loudly, and he paused, hesitating, listening intently. But the sounds of love-making continued uninterrupted, and he resumed his climb, holding the spear before him. The roaring in his ears sounded like a cataract, as if a huge wall of water were tumbling down from a great height and crashing down upon a pile of jagged rocks below. He could not block out the sound, no matter what he did. There was no escaping it. He could hammer his head against a tree until it bled. He could pound his fist against the ground until the skin broke and his knuckle bones protruded, as if he could spatter the very earth into submission. He could run blindly through the forest, tripping over roots, crashing through the underbrush. His hand clamped over his ears in a futile effort to shut out the sound, all to no avail. No matter what he did, the roaring sound would threaten to engulf him, and there was only one thing that could make it go away: blood. Over the horrific pounding in his ears, the tidal waves of noise that slammed away at him relentlessly, a disembodied voice seemed to float up from the depths of his subconscious, a voice that he remembered only very dimly. It was the voice that had spoken to him while he lay in a wooden crib. It was the only voice that had ever spoken to him kindly. His mother's voice.
"Kill them, Jason,"
it commanded him.
"Kill them for Mommy. Kill them all."
He knew them. He knew them all. He knew they were to blame for what had happened to his mother. He knew that the only way he could make the relentless pounding in his head diminish was to sacrifice their lives to the dark forces that threatened to consume him. He moved closer to the door that stood ajar, the door to the bedroom where Jeff and Sandra were making love, oblivious to the horror that approached them. She lay beneath him, her arms clasped tightly around his shoulders, feeling the strong muscles in his back as he drove himself deep inside her, pulling his hips back and driving them forward rhythmically, filling her with the warm liquid heat that pulsed through her in waves. Sandra felt his hot breath against her neck. She felt Jeff's lips brushing against her throat, the tip of his tongue flicking at her earlobe, and her unfocused stare took in a diffused image of the curly blonde locks of his hair that brushed against her face as she hugged him close, making him a part of her. She felt the tremors start from way down in the tips of her toes, building in waves to a feeling that engulfed her, sending her entire body into paracosms of ecstasy as she felt the heat of passion washing over her. She hugged Jeff to her with all of her might, trying to force him into her more deeply, and then the shadow crossed her face, and her gaze focused on the figure standing over them, the horrifying hooded apparition that held the spear aloft, the burning hate-filled eyes that bored directly into hers. She opened her mouth to scream, and then the spear plunged down, plowing through Jeff's back so hard that she felt the brutal impact as the spear penetrated clean through him, then into her own flesh. She heard the hiss of air rushing from Jeff's lungs. She saw the shocked, disbelieving expression on his face. She felt the spray of blood that came out of his mouth and struck her cheek. She felt the searing heat of the spear's iron point tearing through her flesh, plunging through her body, and emerging out the other side. It was driven through them both with such incredible force that it continued on through the mattress of the bed and became embedded in the floor. Sandra did not die right away. She withered in unendurable agony, transfixed by the spear, which united her with Jeff forever in a passionate embrace of death. Blood bubbled up from her lungs and frothed upon her lips. She tried to scream, but found herself choking on her own life fluids. She saw Jeff's sightless eyes like frozen marbles gazing down at her in a glazed stare, and the last image that registered on her conscious mind was the terrifying sight of Jason Voorhees standing over them, clenching and unclenching his fists, staring down at them with utter loathing. She wiggled like a fish impaled on a hook, feeling her life ebbing with every blood-frothed breath she took. She wanted to scream out loud in protest that this could not possibly be happening to her, that she was too young to die, that she had a right to live, but death cared about neither age nor rights. And in a moment it was all over for her, as darkness closed in upon her, and she moved no more. Chapter 8. The bar was a lot louder, a lot smokier, and a lot more crowded as the hour grew late and the people who had already seen the one movie playing in the town drifted in to take advantage of the only other entertainment Crystal Lake had to offer. The band was cranking up, feeding off the energy of the crowd, and the lead singer had gotten drunk enough to lay into some Bob Seger with at least a slight degree of authenticity. Ted's collection of empty beer bottles had grown to about a dozen, and even with his dragster-like metabolism, he was starting to feel seriously buzzed. He had eaten some pizza earlier to cut the booze, but every drink order was just another excuse to talk to the lovely Maggie with her jet black hair, hazel eyes, beautiful long legs, and the blouse that seemed somehow to have come a little more unbuttoned since the last time he had looked at it, which had not been very long ago at all. He wondered if he could possibly just be imagining it. He had been flirting with the girl all evening, trying to get up enough nerve to make a move and hoping that he wasn't sounding like a nerd, when all the time she'd been flirting right back, and he'd been so preoccupied with trying not to look bad that he'd hardly even noticed. Maggie was starting to get a bit concerned that he'd never get his act together. She figured that after a few drinks he'd overcome his shyness and stop with the silly jokes, but he just kept putting them away and acting like an awkward little boy, not being obnoxious, just silly. Everything she'd done to try to let him know that she was interested had gone right past him. She felt exasperated. She was getting tired of winking at him. She felt as if her eye was twitching, and she had already unbuttoned the top 3 buttons on her blouse. If she got any more obvious than that, she'd fall right out. She'd wish to hell he'd stop playing around and come right out and ask her if she was doing anything after she got off work, which would be in about another half an hour. She could tell that he was nervous, but for God's sake, how thick could a guy be? She'd been sending him signals all night long, and he still hadn't picked any of them up. Or if he had, he was too uptight to act on them. Still, it was kind of sweet to see a guy who was so obviously not slick. She was really tired of guys who tried to come on cool and macho. Just about every guy in town had tried to put the make on her, and here was this cute boy, sort of sitting there and goofing around with her, almost as if he was shuffling his feet in the dirt and saying, "Oh gosh, golly shucks." She could hardly believe he was for real. She wanted to wrap him up and take him home and eat him. Paul tipped back his beer bottle and chugged what was left of the brew. He set the bottle down inside. "I've got to get some sleep," he said, knowing that he'd reached his limit. Jenny gave him a knowing look. "I'm tired," she said. Really tired," with an exaggerated yawn. "Quitting already?" Ted asked, dreading the moment of truth now that it had arrived. He glanced at Maggie, wiping down the bar just a couple of feet away. She smiled at him. There was no more putting it off. Somehow he had to get his courage up and ask her. It had to be now or never. "Ted," said Paul, astonished at his capacity, "you'd have me out till breakfast if I let you." Jenny stretched, allowing her hand to gently graze Paul's thigh as it came down. "I'll ride back with you, okay?" she said, hoping that Ted would get the message. "Come on, boy," she thought. "The girl obviously likes you, and we're getting the hell out of your way. Get on with it." Paul gave her a look as he felt her fingers trail over his thigh, perilously close to his groin. He started to gather up his money, except for the tip he was leaving on the bar. Maggie came over to take away their bottles and wished them a good night. "When the place closes, you come back to camp, got it?" said Paul with a big wink at Ted. "Yes, boss." Paul glanced pointedly at Maggie. Then he reached into the pocket of Ted's jacket and removed the keys to Jeff's truck as Ted watched. Dumbfounded, he handed the keys to Maggie. "And let Maggie drive the pickup," winking at her and handing her the keys. Then he turned and walked away with Jenny on his arm. Ted stared after him, open-mouthed, then glanced back at Maggie as she smiled and twirled the truck keys. Ted smiled awkwardly. "Excuse me," he said to her. "Are there any after-hours places around here?" "Sure," she said, smiling, and holding his gaze as she put the keys away inside her pocket. "My place." Jenny gave Paul a nudge as they walked out the front door of the bar. "You're so bad," she said. "No, I'm not. Ted is," Paul said. "I was beginning to think that Maggie would have to rip her blouse open and hold up a sign before he got the damn message." Jenny giggled. "You think you'll be coming back tonight?" she asked. "I don't think so," said Paul, grinning. "Maggie has the keys." He glanced up at the sky. The rain was really coming down. Pretty hard. "Okay," he said, turning the collar of his jacket up. "Let's make a run for it." I'm going," said Jenny, hooking her arm through his and running for the parking lot with her jacket up over her head. They made it to the Volkswagen without getting completely soaked as the rain was coming down in buckets. They rolled up all the windows and Paul grimaced at the trickle of water that immediately started to come in through the roof just above his head. "This thing had better start," he said, shoving the key into the ignition. "You fixed it, remember," Jenny reminded him. "I know. That's what worries me," he said. He turned the key. The starter motor whined in protest several times. There was a frightful clunk, and then the engine coughed, backfired like a bazooka, and caught, settling into a chugging idle that sounded like a dying motorcycle running on one cylinder. Paul glanced at Jenny dubiously. She shrugged with the sign of resignation. He shifted into first and let out the clutch, half expecting the little car to shudder and expire on the spot. Instead, it leapt out of its parking space as if it had been goosed, laying a patch of rubber on the asphalt as it chirped its tires. Nice clutch, thought Paul, as he shifted into second gear, and the VW lurched once more. At this rate, he thought, we might not make it through the night. Vicki was running from her cabin toward the main house through the storm. She made it up the steps of the front porch, just as the sky really seemed to open up. Well, so much for primping, she thought. They were both going to get so soaked. She opened the door and came into the living room, shaking out her hair and looking around. There wasn't anyone in sight. "Mark?" she said. She frowned and walked through the front room and into the kitchen. There was no sign of him. "Mark?" she said again. "Where are you?" Returning to the front room, she wondered where he could have disappeared to. Surely he couldn't have gone up the stairs, not in that wheelchair. She glanced up the darkened stairs, not hearing anything, wondering if Sandra and Jeff knew where he was, unless they'd left or fallen asleep up there. She smiled. Judging by the energetic sounds they had made earlier, they were probably dead by now. "Anybody still there? Hello?" she called hesitantly. "Sandra? Jeff?" She started up the stairs. "Sandra," she said, not really wanting to walk in on them, but worried about Mark. The thunder crashed and lightning briefly illuminated the dark stairwell as she walked softly toward the bedroom door. She knocked twice, waiting for a moment, and then knocked once more. There was no answer. There were no sounds coming from inside. She turned the knob and opened the door a crack. "Sandra?" she whispered, peeking inside. The sheets were pulled over two forms huddled together on the bed. She could see Sandra's hair spilling out over the pillow. Vicki pushed the door open and went inside. She tiptoed over to the bed, thinking perhaps she could just wake Sandra up and not disturb Jeff. She was starting to get really worried about Mark. He was nowhere in the house, and it was raining cats and dogs outside. "Sandra," she whispered, reaching out to touch the sheet that shrouded her form. The sheets were suddenly thrown back, and Jason Voorhees sat up in the bed where he had been lying next to Sandra's dead, blood-spattered body. Vicki screamed as she beheld those two burning eyes gazing out at her from behind the dirty hood. A knife flashed, and she felt as if a red-hot wire had been pulled across her skin. She looked down in horror at the blood bubbling up out of the deep slash in her leg, at the raw flesh laid open by the blade. She backed away, limping in shock and still not fully feeling the pain. She stumbled against the door and recoiled from the sight of Jeff's nude body impaled on a coat hook in the wall, dark blood coagulating on his stomach. She screamed again as Jason stabbed her in the chest, the blade piercing her skin and skipping off the bone. Jason plunged in deeply, then withdrew it and slammed it into her again with pile-driver force. She stopped screaming as a brilliant white-hot light blotted out her sight, and she sank down into the darkness. He watched her while the life trickled out of her, and for a while, a very brief while, the raging fever in him subsided. He was doing what he had to do. He was doing it all for her. Now he had to take them back and show her. He bent down, lifted Vicki by her arms, and dragged her limp corpse across the floor and down the stairs, her trailing feet thumping on the steps. He would bring her downstairs first, and then he would get the others, all of them, to show her how well he was carrying out her wishes. He would carry them all out to the cabin in the woods, and bring them, one at a time, into the back room, her room. He would take them all back to Mother. Okay, Slashaholics, this has been chapters 7 and 8 of Friday the 13th, Part 2, the novelization by Simon Hawke. I want to say thank you to everybody that sent me birthday wishes today on Facebook and Twitter, and even here on YouTube. I've had a very great birthday today. Anybody curious, I turned 36. So yeah, I don't know if you thought I was older or younger, but yeah, I turned 36 today, August 8th. Anyways, I hope you enjoyed these chapters. I know I did. We're really getting to the meat of the story here. We had a lot of action in these chapters tonight. Simon Hawke knows how to write these kill scenes perfectly through Jason's eyes, which I'm going to make a note there because we all know in the movie he's only got one eye hole. but Simon Hawke keeps talking about him just wearing a hood, and people, the characters seeing both of his eyes. So I don't know if that means like a hoodie hood, or if he's got the sack over his head with 2 eye holes. I don't know what's going on with that as far as Simon Hawke's vision goes, but it's kind of creepier that he's able to stare him down with both his eyes, and it's just like a dark silhouette. But anyways, I really enjoyed the scenes with Vicki and Mark. I almost used the clip from the movie where she says "toke," because she just says it so horribly. Like, she's even went on record, the actress, saying that she was a real goody-goody two-shoes, never smoked weed or anything like that, so she had no idea what toke even meant when she did the line. And she laughs at herself now looking back at it. But I thought Mark's scene was a little bit disappointing because, I know at least in the movie, anyways, I thought we were going to get a little more than what we got in the movie with Mark's death. I thought there would be more than just getting the machete in the face like we did in the film. Simon Hawke had a chance to extend some of these kills, and he didn't really do that. I did enjoy the scene at the bar, getting everything set up for why Ted stays behind. I really hope that he pops back up in the novelization. I know he doesn't in the movie. Spoilers, I know. But I really hope the book explains what's up with Ted after Paul and Jenny leave. But who knows? If it doesn't get explained, that's alright. Simon Hawke probably wasn't allowed to take too many liberties. But yeah, I thought, Jeff and Sandra's death was done pretty good. I enjoyed the scene with Jason in the main cabin there before he killed him finding the spear and the mask and all that, and him hearing Pamela's voice. I really enjoyed that little touch. By the way, that was Cecilia Spears reprising her role from the first novelization as Pamela Voorhees. Thank you, Cecilia, for doing those lines on such short notice today. Really appreciate it. I wanted to keep that in there because you've played Pamela so well in the first book. Anytime she pops up, I want you to have that role. But yeah, so the ending there we had with Vicki, I thought was very, very good. It went into a lot more detail on her fate and, the end she met at Jason's hands. And not only that, but we got into Jason's head again about how he needs to take all of them back to the shack to prove to his mother that he's doing the work that she set him out to do. I thought that was a nice Norman Bates type twist to Jason. That not only is he killing these people because he thinks they're all responsible for killing his mother, and that his mother's telling him to, but he's also taking them back to the shack to show her that he's done it, and that's why their bodies are in the shack. Not because he's collecting bodies, but because he wants to prove it to his mom, so he takes it to his mom's room in the shack. That was pretty neat. I also like the addition of Jason's psychotic state. The way, like, whenever he's not killing someone, he's got that pressure in his head, and his heart's pounding, and his head's pounding, and it's like a tidal wave. And then whenever he kills somebody, it goes away for a moment, but then it comes right back. It really explains his character a lot more than we could ever know just by watching the movies. Kind of like Dexter a bit. If you've ever watched Dexter, every time he does one of his kills, that pressure in his head goes away. So it's like he's really toying with the whole psychotic state of Jason's mind here. Even though he's already stated that, Jason's pretty much a zombie at this point. But yeah, thank you so much for listening. And if you haven't done so already, be sure to click that thumbs up button. Be sure to subscribe. Click the bell so you always know of all the new slasher mayhem brewing in the 80s Slasher Library. Check out the links in the description below for our Facebook group page, my Twitter feed, our subreddits, and also our merch store where you can get 10% off all merchandise by using the promo code 10OFF, 10OFF altogether. And also, please check out the Patreon link. This channel is not monetized on YouTube and cannot be, and it's very expensive to keep it going. These books are not cheap, and I depend on awesome listeners like yourself to sign up on Patreon, help support the channel, and keep it going and growing for years to come. You also get some great rewards like free merch, free ebooks. You can voice a character depending on the tier you select. You get an exclusive podcast every week and early access to certain narrations. So much stuff on there. Memberships start as low as $2 per month. And as always, tonight's upload is brought to you by our patrons on the Patreon page. That's Tyrone Kennard, Nick Velcarve, Jeffrey Quick, Daniel Mackey, David Arnold, Alex Vanover, Krista Campbell, Rob Davey, Jay Gardner, Willow Ravenwood, Lauren Vaught, Kristen Kay, Michael, William Schaefer, Liam Anderson, Bree, Bonanza Jellybean, Ryan Woodward, Allison Seib, Iron Alexa, Hawaii, Cecilia Spears, Sean Campbell, Catherine McClear, Tony DeVore, Seminole, and Carl Eakins. And thank you so much for supporting the channel. I couldn't do it without you. I'll be back very soon with more of Friday the 13th Part 2 by Simon Hawke. Until then, this has been your friendly neighborhood 80s slasher librarian saying, thanks for listening, be excellent to each other, and don't click that thumbs down button, because
it's got a death curse!
There's a lover in